Ironically, the very term paranormal was first introduced into our vocabulary as an alternative to the idea of supernatural. Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. You might say I'm Jeffrey Mishlove's alter ego and conversation partner. Today, we're going to be discoursing on the normalization of the paranormal. What do we mean by that? It seems like a contradiction in terms. And indeed it is. How can the paranormal be normal? Because it's already paranormal. Ironically, the very term paranormal was first introduced into our vocabulary as an alternative to the idea of supernatural dealing with spirits, the spirit world, the realm of theology, other gods, other entities, and the like. And the term paranormal seemed to suggest that, no, we're not talking about any of that stuff. We're just talking about something that is very unusual. It can be explained by natural laws, but it's so rare that we'll call it paranormal instead. Unfortunately, that strategy didn't work too well with the skeptics who want to have none of it. And in fact, let me be clear, I'm not talking about real skeptics. We're talking about people who are better identified as scoffers. But these people who call themselves skeptics and are not real skeptics, because a real skeptic is first and foremost in the philosophical tradition of skepticism, skeptical of themselves. But people these days who call themselves skeptics, and I'm talking about the ones who are scoffers of the paranormal, are very sure of themselves. The last thing they want to be skeptical of is their own strong opinion that anything labeled as paranormal can easily be explained away. If we go back to the roots of the problem, we have to go back at least to biblical times, because there are injunctions in the book of Leviticus very specifically against consorting with spirits or being a soothsayer or practicing divination. And these practices were considered punishable by death, by stoning. And the great irony is that the purpose of these biblical injunctions, well, it's not entirely clear, but they largely occur in the book of Leviticus, along with the same laws that prohibit eating pork or eating shellfish or mixing milk with meat. Of course, in the Christian world, none of these laws are obeyed. And in the book of Leviticus, as many people now know, there are also prohibitions against homosexuality. There are scholars who argue that the various prohibitions in the book of Leviticus have 2 different origins. One of these origins is simply to distinguish the Jewish people from the other neighboring religions, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, etc., in the neighborhood, and their practices. So the idea is that we don't want to be like those people. And the other source of the laws of Leviticus are considered to be moral laws that are independent of cultural identity, but laws that are true for all time, like cheating and stealing and etc., and murder. The question that people have had to deal with is, are we to throw out the laws against soothsaying and consorting with spirits and divination, the same way we threw out the laws concerning the dietary regime, which are also considered abominations in the eyes of the Lord. And the truth is that in Western culture, although, by which I mean Christian culture, although the dietary laws were abandoned, the persecution of witchcraft continued. And it's believed historically that as many as 100,000 people, largely women, were put to death because of being accused of witchcraft. That is a very heavy burden that we have all inherited. It is part of Western culture. Well, you might say, so what? That was a long time ago. But was it really? It turns out that the last person convicted of witchcraft in the Western world, to my knowledge, was Helen Duncan, who was convicted and imprisoned for witchcraft in 1944. Now, that's an unusual case, and I'll talk about it later, but really more relevant for our discussion today are the individuals here in the United States who were put to death for witchcraft in the late 1600s, in the 17th century, prior to the establishment of the American Constitution, at a time when Massachusetts was still a colony. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the Salem witchcraft trials. Today, the word witch hunt is used a lot in a political context, and well, it should be, because Arthur Miller, a great playwright, wrote one of his most famous plays, The Crucible, and it was about the Salem witchcraft trials. But it was written in the 1950s. And what Arthur Miller was doing at that time was using the witchcraft trials as a metaphor for what was going on in the era of Joseph McCarthy and the anti-communist purges taking place, the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s in Washington, D.C., which I think most historians today would agree was a very disgraceful period in American culture, where people were persecuted because maybe they had a family member who decades ago had joined some sort of group that was affiliated with communism. And they lost their jobs, or they were forbidden to, even, for example, many screenwriters in Hollywood were blacklisted as a result of that. And in fact, historians looking back at the witchcraft trials will say that a lot of it was political. People were jealous of their property and wanted to confiscate it, or there were other things going on. It didn't have to do with real witchcraft. That's the modern interpretation. The modern paradigm is that witchcraft doesn't even exist. There is no such thing as real witchcraft. How silly that these people in earlier generations thought that they needed to put witches to death. But I should say that is exactly what they thought. And I believe the number of people in Massachusetts who were condemned to death as a result of the Salem witchcraft trials, about 16 or 17 different individuals, including one 80-year-old man, Mr. Giles, as I recall, who refused to defend himself in court when accused of witchcraft and was subjected to a heavy punishment, the equivalent of stoning. No, they didn't throw stones at him as they might have done in earlier centuries. But what they did do is they placed heavy stones upon him. And after 2 days, he died. So the idea that you shall not suffer a witch to live was a dominant paradigm in Western culture for centuries. And it hasn't died out entirely today by any means. We have this history hanging over us. How can we normalize something that was once considered such an abomination that anybody accused, even on the basis of flimsy evidence, must be put to death? Ironically, the people who are most opposed to entertaining the possibility of the paranormal these days would claim that there is no such thing as witchcraft whatsoever. But what we must worry about, not witchcraft, of course, because it doesn't exist, but the rising tide of superstition. That is what they protest against and why they fear anything having to do with parapsychology and the paranormal. People talk a lot about paradigms. And I had a mentor I've spoken about many times when I was a college student, Arthur M. Young, the author of The Reflexive Universe, a person who felt that he had created a theory of everything, a new paradigm. But he pointed out to me that if we take paradigm in the way that Thomas Kuhn used that word in his great book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a paradigm is something unconscious. You're not even really quite aware that you're holding such a paradigm. And for Arthur Young, the change in our attitude towards witchcraft was the epitome of a change in paradigms, going from the idea that witchcraft must be punished by death to going to the idea that, oh, there is no such thing as witchcraft. That's a real paradigm change. And it's been debated in Western culture for centuries. For example, you may not know that King James, the British king, Scottish king actually, who authorized the King James Bible, was something of a philosopher and wrote a book about demonology. And his argument was that witchcraft does indeed exist. In other words, consorting with demons, as he would have thought of it, does indeed exist. After all, he argued, why would the Bible prohibit such a practice? If it didn't actually exist, there would have been no need to prohibit it. Modern scholars argue, some do at least, that no, it wasn't prohibited because it was a real thing. It was prohibited as a way to distinguish the Jewish people from their neighbors. The Jewish people were to think of themselves as righteous and pure and clean, whereas their neighbors in the Middle East were impure and unclean, and the Jews should have very little to do with them. For example, don't intermarry. Whereas many ancient cultures, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans or the Hindus or the Babylonians or the Persians, all had magical practices that were accepted as normal and natural. In Western culture, the practices associated with the paranormal, with psi, with psychic functioning, with communication with the deceased, these things were all clouded by the biblical injunction up until as recently as 1944, when Helen Duncan was sent to prison. I might mention a little bit about Helen Duncan. I said I would do so. Most people today, when they look at her history, would say that Helen Duncan was a fraud. In fact, she was convicted of fraud. There are photographs showing her in conducting seances that appear to be obvious frauds in which ectoplasm comes out of her mouth, but it's cheesecloth that she had originally swallowed, and the so-called spirits were so obviously fake, it's hardly worth bothering with. And yet, Helen Duncan, at her trial, had many people who came and testified to the authenticity of the spirit materializations and the other manifestations with which she was associated. And to make matters even more complex, it seems that during the Second World War, which is when this trial occurred, an incident took place, I think it was in 1941, when a British warship, the HMS Barham, as I recall, was sunk by German U-boats in the Mediterranean off the coast of Egypt, and over 800 sailors lost their lives. This is during wartime, and the British government wanted to keep this tragic loss a secret. But according to reports, Helen Duncan, during a seance, had communicated with one of those sailors who had drowned when the ship was torpedoed. And she announced, the Barham has been sunk. And it's something that was considered a state secret. That's why she was put on trial. Basically, they wanted to keep her quiet. They were afraid that she was going to reveal state secrets. And they put her in jail for that reason. But the laws against witchcraft remained on the books. They were revised after her persecution. Winston Churchill, in particular, was upset that these ancient laws that had not been employed for over a century were used in the Helen Duncan case. People alive in recent times, I don't know if they're still alive as of this moment, but during my lifetime, they were alive and they had attended seances with Helen Duncan. And there are many amazing reports I would refer you to, for example, on the New Thinking Aloud channel, the interviews with Stuart Alexander, who is a physical medium himself and has studied carefully the history of physical mediumship, and new people who attended the seances with Helen Duncan, and the things that they reported witnessing could not possibly be explained by the kind of cheap tricks of which Helen Duncan had been accused. But certainly the argument for the normalization of the paranormal is not going to rest on the case of Helen Duncan, or very likely not going to rest on cases involving mediumship in general, for the simple reason that most of those cases occur under conditions which are less than scientifically optimal. As a parapsychologist, I find the evidence that comes out of seances and spiritual sessions very interesting and very important, but they're not the strongest evidence. If we want to look at the normalization of the paranormal, there are three things that we need to turn to. And I'm going to discuss each of those in turn in this discourse. The first of these is simply empirical evidence conducted under well-controlled laboratory conditions. Data. And parapsychology has plenty of that kind of data. But data alone isn't enough. The second level of normalization of the paranormal has to do with practical applications. Can it be useful to people? And indeed, I'm going to share with you a wide range of practical applications of psychic abilities. But even that isn't enough. The third factor we have to consider in looking at the normalization of the paranormal is the theory. Do we have a theory that can explain it? Because in the absence of a theory, it might just be supernatural, which is considered by the philosophical movement known as naturalism to be forbidden. Nothing supernatural can exist. If it exists, it must be natural. That's their philosophy. And it's not a bad philosophy, really, except when it automatically eliminates a whole class of empirical evidence from discussion. That's not acceptable to me. You have to look at all the evidence. If it exists, then we have to assume that it's natural, and that's where the empirical evidence comes in. But what we really need to tie all of this down is some sort of a theoretical framework by which this realm of phenomena can be understood. And in fact, there's a great deal of theoretical work having to do with the paranormal and parapsychology, and I'm going to review that as well in this discourse. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but the scientific, empirical case for paranormal phenomenon was pretty much settled by 1940. And I say that because that's the year when a classic book was published called Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years. Mostly produced by Gaither Pratt, an associate of J.B. Rhine, although the publisher gave J.B. Rhine credit as the first author because he was more famous. J.B. Rhine established the parapsychology laboratory at Duke University in the 1930s, and it was something of a revolution in the study of the paranormal because he employed experimental methods and statistics and did basically card-guessing experiments. Many of you may be familiar with the Zener cards that had 5 different symbols, a wavy line across a square, a circle, and people were asked to guess which card was being viewed by another person out of sight from them. And J.B. Rhine did thousands of these experiments and determined that statistically speaking, the results were significant. They could not be accounted for by chance, but they were very small, nevertheless. Still, this was science. This put the study of the paranormal on a different footing. And naturally, the skeptics, scoffers, I should say, couldn't tolerate the idea that the human mind was capable of receiving information that couldn't be accounted for by normal sensory channels, or that the human mind was capable of influencing such things as the fall of dice without doing anything using the muscles or the nervous system or any part of the body to influence the dice. How could that be? In the absence of an explanation, it was intolerable to them. But let me be clear, there was a deeper reason for all of this hostility, a reason that probably goes back to the subconscious fear of witchcraft. But why are we afraid of witchcraft to begin with? I got a clue. Back in the 1970s, when I was still a graduate student at Berkeley, in fact, I sponsored Uri Geller's first major public appearance in the United States on the Berkeley campus at Zellerbach Auditorium. It was overflowing. We had to turn people away, even though the auditorium held 1,800 people at the time. And around that same time, Geller was in the news everywhere, and Time magazine had done a big story, and a paper had been published in Nature that included studies with Uri Geller. It was very controversial. It was everyone was talking about it. Spoon bending was a big fad. And who should appear as a speaker at the Berkeley campus? None other than Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer. Arthur Clarke had just published in Time magazine a statement hostile to Uri Geller. And I found that peculiar because if you read some of his novels, like Childhood's End, you will see that he seemed to be friendly towards the paranormal as a novelist. So as Clark was speaking on campus and I'm in the audience and he completed his talk, I raised my hand and asked him a question. I said, "Mr. Clark, do you believe in ESP?" And I thought his answer was incredibly revealing. He said to me, "No, I do not believe in ESP because I don't want anyone to read my mind." And that, I think, is the basis for much of the antagonism, the hostility, the scoffers, the so-called skeptics who want to have nothing to do with the paranormal and who insist without any evidence that there is no such thing as paranormal. Of course, it's hard to prove a negative, but the point is a deep one. Sigmund Freud wrote an entire philosophy, an entire school of psychotherapy based on the premise that we don't want to know what's in our own mind. That's the basis of the Freudian defense mechanisms, deep repression. We hide ourselves from ourselves. Freud wrote about this very eloquently in a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. You see, we're animals, but we form societies, and societies are predicated on the idea that we are going to restrain our animalistic urges. We can't just go about behaving in a violent or in a sexual manner with other humans. We must be civilized. And so our animal urges were considered inappropriate. At the same time, we all have them. And we don't want to acknowledge our own inappropriate thoughts. We certainly don't want other people to be able to see our inappropriate thoughts. At least that was clearly what Arthur C. Clarke was communicating to me. And, of course, if you study his biography carefully, you'll see that he had his reasons. I'm not going to go into that any further at this point, but the truth is we all have our reasons. Or maybe I should say we all had our reasons, because things are changing slowly. There's what might be called the Atman Project by the philosopher Ken Wilber, the making of the unconscious conscious. It's something you see in the media today. Things that were taboo in the 1950s are now commonly discussed on television. Things having to do with our forbidden thoughts and desires, for example. People are becoming more willing to acknowledge the shadow, the dark side of human behavior. So the excuse that I don't want other people to read my mind, therefore the paranormal doesn't exist, is becoming a weaker excuse, a less potent excuse, decade by decade. Now, why is ESP, after 60 years, or some people simply say ESP 60, such an important book? The reason is quite simple. The critics attacked J.B. Rhine viciously when he came out in the 1930s with his first books on extrasensory perception. In fact, it got so bad that even though he was a world-famous scientist with a world-famous laboratory under the auspices of Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, he sought psychiatric help in order to deal with his feelings of being persecuted by these skeptics. And he set out to address the problem in a scientific way by collecting every single criticism, technical, experimental criticism of his research and the research of others working along the same lines that had been published since the very first experimental reports were known in the 1880s. Whether or not we accept the existence of psi phenomena, which is the term parapsychologists use for what they study. Psychokinesis, mind over matter, extrasensory perception, including precognition, clairvoyance, and telepathy, and the question of life after death. People might say, and skeptics often say, this is a total waste of time. It's totally useless. But J.B. Rhine, whether or not you even accept his data, made great strides in the improvement of scientific methodology in general. He pioneered advances in statistics, for example. And I don't mean only J.B. Rhine, but including people who were working in his laboratory and with his laboratory, which included statisticians and other scientists worldwide who were taking an interest in his discoveries. And what he did in ESP after 60 years is collect every single published criticism and then pointed out one by one the various experiments that addressed those criticisms and accounted for them and still got positive data. So there we are in 1940. The phenomenon was sufficiently robust to withstand every single criticism that had been offered at that time. Now, let me be fair to the scoffers. They've come up with new criticisms since then. However, the research has continued to expand and become more and more sophisticated over the decades. We're now 80 years or 85 years past 1940, and we're still getting better and better results all the time. So I think it's fair to say that the criticism that there is no data, you'll hear skeptics, let me put it differently, you'll hear scoffers say there isn't a shred of evidence. For some reason, they love that word, shred. But the truth is there are well over 1,000 experimental studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals of parapsychology and other journals, non-parapsychology journals that publish these experiments as well. The data is very strong from a statistical perspective. But I have to add that in real life, outside the laboratory, spontaneous psychic experiences are even much stronger. And of course, occasionally in the laboratory as well, you get incredible, astronomically difficult tasks accomplished in the laboratory, such as guessing all 25 cards in a row in a deck of Zener cards. The odds of doing that are astronomically small, but it's happened on more than one occasion. Still, empirical evidence by itself hasn't moved the needle much. Certainly, there are people who will tell you, like the statistician Jessica Utz, who's been interviewed on this channel, that the data in favor of parapsychology and psi phenomena is much stronger than, for example, the well-accepted findings that taking aspirin will help reduce heart attacks and strokes. I take a baby aspirin every day to reduce the risk of stroke, so I'm well aware of how that data is accepted. But the data for ESP and psychokinesis is even stronger than that. That brings us to the second leg of our three-legged stool here, supporting the existence or the normalization of the paranormal, and that's practical applications. It's interesting that the first biblical accounts of the practical application of psychic abilities had to do with warfare. There are several examples, and including the famous one where the Hebrew king Saul consults the witch of Endor, who raises up the spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel, and Saul is asking for battle strategies. He's about to go into battle against the Philistines. And unfortunately, Samuel tells him, well, you're going to be killed. and your armies will lose, and apparently that is what happened. And there are other examples that turned out to be more positive for the Hebrew people in those days, but they speak positively about the usefulness of psychic functioning. And I bring that up now because we are living at this moment in the aftermath of a 20-year research project sponsored by the government of the United States of America, developing the discipline of remote viewing and applying it for all sorts of espionage and intelligence purposes, locating kidnapped soldiers, locating drug runners, and the like. This data has been analyzed and discussed endlessly. There have been well over a dozen books published on it. And one thing we know for sure, year after year after year, for 20 years, the government continued to fund this research because they were getting results that the various government intelligence agencies who were the clients of this program and would come to them for information in cases where they had run up against a blank wall. They needed information and couldn't get it any other way. And often enough, that information proved to be useful and instrumental in apprehending drug smugglers or recovering lost aircraft. So there's that. But that's not all. My friend Stefan Schwartz, who has been interviewed on the New Thinking Aloud channel dozens of times, pioneered the use of remote viewing in archaeological research, uncovering buried artifacts in the sands of the Sahara Desert, for example, and has found that the remote viewers he worked with in that circumstance could be pinpoint accurate within a fraction of an inch in telling archaeologists, dig here at this spot and this is what you will find at a depth of, let us say, 6 feet or some precise depth. And there are many interviews with Schwartz and others on this channel showing the usefulness of remote viewing for finding missing people, for solving crimes, and in archaeology. But that's not all. There's a whole line of research in the area of distant healing. This is quite amazing that you might be able to influence a biological system with your thoughts at a distance. I'm talking thousands of miles here. And this research also has been going on for decades. I'll give you one example. I remember from my early days back in the 1970s, there was a very well-known healer named Olga Worrell. She had a spiritual healing church and a great reputation, and she was happy to work with scientists. So my friends Beverly Rubik and Elizabeth Rauscher set up a series of experiments using bacteria. And having her here's what they would do. They would have the bacteria in laboratory conditions, in test tubes and the like, and they would try to kill the bacteria or influence them negatively by imposing a detergent into the petri dishes where the bacteria were kept, because a detergent can kill the bacteria. Then Olga Worrell would be asked to heal those poor bacteria, and they could make measurements. And indeed, and they could compare, of course, using a control group, double-blind experiment, the most rigorous scientific conditions. Yes, Olga Worrell was able to heal the bacteria. Olga Worrell was able to influence subatomic particles in a cloud chamber over thousands of miles. I should also mention a whole body of research on precognition, obtaining information about events that haven't yet happened in terms of our understanding of time. And of course, that data is also overwhelmingly statistically significant. I referred briefly to the issue of solving crimes, but that's another big area in which psychics or remote viewers have been involved for many decades. I myself had a working relationship with one such person, Kathleen Ray, a psychic who was called upon, and I had to testify in court now that I think about it, on one of her cases. She was called upon to find a missing fellow, Mr. Drummond, who had disappeared in the woods in Calaveras County. The sheriff there had been searching for 6 months to find this missing man. Finally, they called upon a psychic, my friend Kathleen Ray, who from her home hundreds of miles from the location described where they would find the body. And the sheriff said, I know where that is. We looked in that area. Let's go back and look again. And they did, and they found Drummond's body exactly as she had specified under a bush, not particularly molested by animals even after 6 months. In that condition. So in spite of strong empirical evidence, in spite of practical applications, serious skeptical critics of parapsychology were still unsatisfied. These are not the scoffers. These are people who would like to believe but felt, how do we explain this? The standard view of the world is based on what you could call physicalism or materialism, that the universe as we know it is based on atoms and molecules and subatomic particles bouncing around like billiard balls. And psychic phenomena just didn't seem to fit in. You can explain a lot of things using that model, but you can't really explain consciousness at all, any form of consciousness. And that's the big bugaboo in philosophy today. We don't know what to do with consciousness. But consciousness is a problem only if you're a materialist. If you believe that you have to explain consciousness as somehow the product of material things, particles and atoms and molecules bouncing around, or even forces like electromagnetic forces moving through the neurons in the brain and ionic activity. The truth of the matter is you can't get from here to there. Bouncing billiard ball type particles just never result in consciousness as far as anybody in the field of philosophy or science has been able to demonstrate to date. Now, I keep an open mind about it. I personally think someday material science may well explain consciousness. I haven't ruled it out. And the reason I haven't ruled it out is because we are still working on the definitions of what we mean by materialism, by the material world, by physicalism. For example, what is time? What is space? Could there be multiple dimensions of time and space of which our present science is unaware? Could we eventually have an expanded definition of time and space that could account for such things as the survival of human consciousness after death? I think it's possible. And in fact, I'm not the only one. There are many scientists who have looked at this question going back to the 19th century. In fact, people have proposed the idea of multiple dimensions, which is quite consistent with the ancient shamanistic traditions. You can say there are the higher worlds and the lower worlds, and they're populated by conscious entities. And they don't exist in this three-dimensional world, but there are other worlds that are still physical. They're just not part of our three-dimensional reality, although they're capable of interacting with it. So I hold out the possibility that someday we will have a material explanation that will account for psychic phenomena, for what we call the paranormal. That's why it was called the paranormal instead of the supernatural. Supernatural would imply it'll never be explained in terms of natural science. Paranormal suggests it might be. We hope it will be. And I basically subscribe to that point of view. However, there's yet another alternative to consider. In fact, there are many alternatives to consider because there are many, many different theories that have been proposed to account for consciousness. But the one I think that deserves our attention right now is the idea that it's not matter, molecules, atoms, and particles bouncing around, or waves, forces, force fields, and the like. It's something else that is fundamental to reality, and that something else is consciousness. That consciousness is actually primary, not matter. That viewpoint would account for all of the phenomena of the paranormal. If you say to yourself that it's not the brain that produces consciousness, it's consciousness that produces the brain. That the brain exists within consciousness rather than consciousness existing within the brain. That's what I would have to call a paradigm shift. That's a paradigm shift that would be just as significant as going from witches must be stoned to death to witchcraft doesn't exist. Is to say that the universe is made out of matter as opposed to the universe is a construct of consciousness itself. This is not a new idea, incidentally. The idea that consciousness is primary is fundamental pretty much to all religious traditions. In the beginning, God created the world. It's the first sentence in the book of Genesis in Hebrew. Bereshit bara Adonai et hashamayim v'et ha'oretz. In the beginning, God, consciousness, created the heavens and the earth. And you get the same idea in Hindu philosophy. It is fundamental to all theological traditions. And it could substitute for materialist thinking in the field of science. You can do empirical science from what philosophers call an idealist perspective just as much as from a materialist perspective. And I should point out in the history of philosophy itself, many great philosophers have subscribed to the position that consciousness is primary. I'm talking about well-known philosophers like Kant, like Schopenhauer, like Schelling, the German idealists. There are also the British idealists, Berkeley and Bradley and others. So idealism in philosophy is a metaphysical position that places consciousness at the center of the universe rather than dead matter. And that's a framework that could account for everything we call the paranormal. There's a very interesting twist on that idea that consciousness is primary, which is the idea that the world we live in is analogous to a computer simulation. This is the philosophy that is really gaining in strength right now, that we are almost like characters in a computer game, like World of Warfare. It's the philosophy that is expressed in Thomas Campbell's book, My Big Toe, toe meaning theory of everything. It is a philosophy that has been promulgated by the British philosopher Nick Bostrom. In technical books, Rizwan Virk, a computer scientist, has written 2 books about it and has been interviewed on the New Thinking Aloud channel about the simulation hypothesis. So the idea is that, yes, it's as if we're living in a computer game, but who's the programmer? The ultimate programmer, you could say, is consciousness itself, or what Thomas Campbell calls the larger consciousness system. To be honest, is sort of a more neutral way of talking about God. But beyond that, there are good reasons to think that we are in the process of going through an enormous theoretical transformation in science. I didn't even mention As a matter of fact, the impact of quantum physics and general relativity, the sciences that developed in the early 20th century by people like Albert Einstein and Max Planck, we are still digesting the implications of those findings. But as long ago as 1968, as I recall, an article appeared in Scientific American saying that if the parapsychologists hadn't already discovered the paranormal phenomenon, we quantum physicists would be predicting that they should, because the things that parapsychologists report are quite analogous to the things that we see happening every day in the laboratory at the quantum level. That's another way to approach the phenomenon. Things like quantum entanglement, for example. The idea that everything is connected with everything is now becoming an accepted fact. In fact, it was just a year or two ago when the Nobel Prize was awarded to people for their discoveries in the area of quantum entanglement. It has become accepted, what is known as the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky paradox. Einstein, you see, argued, even though he was very interested in telepathy, at one point he argued against quantum physics. He said quantum physics can't be true because, according to a thought experiment he had conducted with his colleagues, Podolsky and Rosen, the implications were what he called spooky action at a distance. So therefore, we have to dismiss quantum theory. But now, after decades of research, we know quantum theory is correct. Einstein was wrong on that point. And spooky action at a distance, or quantum entanglement, is now accepted as standard in physics. In summary, we can say this. There is a vast amount of empirical evidence supporting the existence of the paranormal. An article published in the American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, in 2018, written by my friend Etzel Cardania, who's been interviewed on the New Thinking Aloud channel, points out that there are some 1,400 different experiments that have been published in research journals in parapsychology along several different lines of evidence, ranging from remote viewing to physiological measurements to studies done with what are called random number generators or random event generators. Decade after decade after decade after decade, no matter how tight the experimental conditions get, the evidence seems to persist. It's not that it's 100%. Of course, there are studies that get zero results. This occurs in every field of experimental science dealing with human beings. All of the behavioral sciences are statistical in nature, and so is parapsychology. So it's a statistical phenomenon. It's not so different from baseball, where you can be a world-class baseball player with a batting average over 300. Well, that means that you strike out more often than you get a hit. But we don't doubt that people can hit home runs in baseball or get base hits in baseball. And the paranormal works very much that way. But it's not only the evidence, it's the fact that it can be applied usefully in military and government intelligence cases, in healing people, in archaeological research, and in many other areas, including frivolous things like sports betting, as a matter of fact. You have to appreciate that it can take generations for these ideas to seep into the general public, but it's been generations at this point. And I think we are on the precipice of a new era, an era in which we'll no longer be talking about the paranormal. We'll be accepting these phenomena as something normal and natural. I think that will be a big step forward for people because, let's face it, almost everyone has a paranormal experience at some point in their life. You don't have to have them every day, as some people do. I, for example, had paranormal experiences back when I was in my early 20s that have set the course for my career for decades thereafter. 1 or 2 good ones in a lifetime is sufficient, but it's very important to acknowledge these experiences. I hear from people almost daily who are so grateful to know that other people out there are studying these phenomena and they're real, and you don't have to think of yourself as on the edge of insanity because you're having such experiences. The truth is, they are normal. They are natural. They can be very disturbing at times, but I hear from people who say, even though it was disturbing, after I began to digest the experience, it became the source of enormous growth for me. So let me conclude my discussion today by saying we are entering into a new era which can be characterized as the normalization of the paranormal. Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with me too.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.